This is a book called The Foundations of Geopolitics, authored by one of Russia's most controversial political theorists, Alexander Dugin. It was written in 1997, 3 years before Vladimir Putin was to become president of Russia, and nearly 25 years before Russia would invade Ukraine. It contains a peculiar, fascinating, and above all, terrifying strategy roadmap that sees Russia rise again to superpower status, extending its influence as far as the Atlantic, bringing Germany and France to heel, annexing many of its former Soviet republics, and reducing Turkey to a rump state. It is a power fantasy born from deep-seated insecurities and anxieties, and it is this fantasy that was in many ways seized upon by the Russian political establishment to combat the perceived loss of prestige in a world dominated by NATO, Europe, and the United States. How did this pathology come to pass? And how did, in a broader sense, Russia step off the path of democracy in favour of hyper-nationalism, irredentism, and authoritarianism? Well, let's start at the beginning, when the Soviet Union collapsed and when Russia transitioned to a young democracy, 1991. Out of the gate, there were already obstacles to the creation of a strong democratic state and the erosion of authoritarianism. Despite Mikhail Gorbachev's democratizing reforms in the 1980s, through glasnost and perestroika, some of the top-down framework of the Soviet Union remained, particularly when it came to the influence and economic clout of the political elite that had inherited Russia's democracy. In the absence of a strong democratic institutional framework and civil society, political loyalties were primarily constructed around personal ties and ideological similarities. This meant that even in the first days of Russian democracy, the system favoured strong men who wielded considerable personal influence over the rest of their parties. According to Tatiana Voroshikina, a Russian political scientist, personal loyalty and group solidarity played a crucial role in the formation of new power centres. This led to a culture of nepotism and clientelism, which was facilitated by the still largely untouched backlog of state-owned industries and businesses that were distributed to political allies at will under Yeltsin. So, the system tended towards clientelism, which created an insular and self-serving political elite more concerned with maintaining their own prosperity rather than furthering democratic progress. This is an important reality that we will return to later. However, democracies are not only dictated by the political elite. Mass mobilization of popular sentiments could still dethrone these people, right? Well, since the public sphere didn't really exist in any significant capacity, and it was distrusted heavily, it was difficult for independent public movements to form. This was exacerbated by the fact that, due to media companies being largely distributed on the basis of personal favours, establishment politicians frequently had the means to direct public sentiment in their favour. For example, in 1993, when Boris Yeltsin attempted to consolidate presidential powers and strengthen the executive, voters narrowly supported him in a referendum on the constitutional amendments needed to do so. Yeltsin, whose government controlled the state media that platformed his opponents, warned his opposition to lay off any criticism of his proposed constitution. This gives a strong indication to what effect the political privatization had on electoral diversity and freedom of expression. It often disincentivized dissenting media and opinion in favor of the establishment and made informed decision-making on the behalf of the public very difficult. This stagnant political environment lent itself to authoritarianism. The Russian people did have an inkling that not all was well with the current democratic system, and that they were not receiving the promised benefits of democratization, while others, mostly political elites, were. One must only look at the success of the St. Petersburg independent, Alexander Nevzorov, a man who never campaigned in any seriousness and owed his prominence to a TV show, but captured the grievances of the Russian people and won the city's seat. He lamented that reform has meant nothing but bandits, beggars and blood. Nothing to the pensioners living next to the shops selling your imported food. For many people, this was the reality. But instead of seeing the faults of Yeltsin's democracy as an opportunity to reform, people saw it as a failure of democracy itself. This, compounded by the fact that Russia's economy was floundering, meant that voters were more likely to default to nationalism, and in turn project their anxieties of domestic problems against the backdrop of Western success and geopolitical encroachment. It was the perfect storm for nationalism, irredentism, and authoritarianism. In the same year that Yeltsin pushed through his constitutional reforms, a nationalist by the name of Vladimir Zhirinovsky was gaining ground, receiving 23% of the popular vote in the 1993 Duma elections, on a platform that aimed to tackle Russia's economic problems, but also to end Russia's humiliation abroad. He was not alone either. Nevzorov, for instance, was anti-Western and heavily isolationist, stating in 1993, Russia's 1,000-year tradition of distrusting change and foreigners is stronger than ever. He also produced documentaries that depicted pro-independence movements in Latvia as puppets of Western forces and the Moscow loyalists that suppressed them as heroes. The St. Petersburg runner-up to Nevzorov, Yuri Vodovin, also noted that, under communism, we lived badly. But we always consoled ourselves with the thought that we had better tanks, that we were a mighty superpower. People today have lost that feeling. It is no wonder then that hostility towards NATO and the West rose in the coming years, as domestic economic hardships and the distrust of democracy coalesced with the feeling that they had received the short straw, to create a great feeling of indignance, insecurity, and anxiety. It did not help that the US and the rest of the Western cohort had marginalized Russia by admitting them to the Partnership for Peace in 1994, after the domestic elections indicated a return to form for authoritarians and communists. The PFP was seen as, quote, nothing more than a ploy to put some countries on a fast track to membership while keeping others, like Russia, within a meaningless framework, a school from which they would never be able to graduate. This communicated to the nascent Russian democracy that it would never be accepted into the club of elite Western nations. It was a vote of no confidence in Russia's democracy, according to Dmitry Trenin, a Russian political scientist. This led to the political alienation of some Russian Democrats, of course, but it also stoked the revival of NATO's enemy image among the Russian populace and political establishment. Contemporaries noted the process as it was happening. In the weeks following Russia's strong nationalist showing in December of 1993, Russia's foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, stated that Eastern Europe must strengthen the hand of Russian Democrats and weaken the ground for the nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky. If Eastern European states immediately join NATO, this will play into Zhirinovsky's hand and do little to enhance their security in practical terms. He had also stated merely 2 weeks earlier that NATO expansion could threaten to exacerbate anxiety among the Russian people as they take NATO's advance as the approach of danger to the motherland's borders, thus promoting anti-Western forces and isolationist tendencies. The importance of these developments is highlighted by the author Mark B. Smith, who argues in his book The Russian Anxiety, the West maintained the external institutional architecture of the Cold War, and by keeping Russia as their foil, they failed even to provide the rhetorical support that might have made democracy seem right for the Russian people. So, nerves frayed and pride wounded, Russia attempted to sideline its traditional great power aspirations in return for prosperity and success in the European structure of interdependence and democracy. When this did not come, when domestic prosperity slowed and democracy appeared to be nothing more than a way for the political elite to enrich themselves, and the West still treated it as an enemy, it is no surprise that it defaulted to historical anxieties and sought domestic assurances for safety and prosperity. These were, of course, nationalistic and authoritarian in nature. I am not usually of the opinion that history repeats itself, but the tale of economic hardship and the feeling of being mistreated by a superior power has led to nationalism in the past. George Kennan, the eminent Cold War ambassador to Moscow, having seen the resentment and violent nationalism brought about in Weimar Germany after its punishment at the hands of European powers after the Great War, warned of the mistakes of enacting excessive reparation or punitive action against a defeated country. It seems in the wake of the Soviet collapse, the West, and the United States more specifically, did not heed this warning. They capitalized on the aversion to Russia many Eastern European countries still held and expanded their power. This was in order to, as one 1992 cornerstone security policy put it, ensure that, quote, Russia, should it seek to do so, cannot establish a hegemonic position in Eastern Europe, unquote. But, simultaneously, this same document argued there should be increased assistance given to Russia to encourage democratic political systems and free markets, so that they too can join the democratic zone of peace. So the West employed a hydra-headed approach that attempted to secure territorial security against Russia should it turn to irredentism, and simultaneously foster democracy and free market systems there as well. As history has shown, the two paths were incompatible, because as the West advanced, it was communicating to Russia that the old order still persisted, but the West still saw Russia as an enemy, and that harmony was a pipe dream. Throughout the next decade, Russian democracy would become even more of a shell than it already was. Yeltsin, who was struggling to keep corruption charges at bay, would make a decision that would dictate the history of 21st century Russia. On December 31st, 1999, he designated Vladimir Putin, then director of the FSB, to be his successor. Putin was a loyal ally, and more importantly, he would be able to rein in the judiciary and protect Yeltsin and his family from prosecution. In a fitting end to Yeltsin's presidency, that oversaw a Russia plagued with clientelism, favoritism, media censorship, and pork-barrel politics, he used his last breath of political power to ensure Putin was elected in March of 2000, marshalling the media to place him as the foremost candidate in the running and amending election laws in his favor. A final self-serving blow to democracy. Following Putin's election, he announced lifelong legal immunity would be bestowed upon Yeltsin. In the background, the economic situation still worsened, and in July of 1997, 3 new member states were put on track to NATO membership. Enlargement may undermine the very security and stability NATO is seeking. It could result in a repolarized Europe. Moscow may question its commitment to nuclear downsizing and cooperation, and Russia might turn away from accommodation with the West, one analyst writing for the New York Times warned. Not only did it do this, but it also caused Russia's citizens to further abandon democracy and to pursue nationalistic alternatives that promised them a path to respect and former glory, a way out of a hole that the promised solution, democracy, had failed to get them out of. Alexander Dugin's book was not a determining factor in the rise of authoritarianism, nationalism, and in effect fascism. It was a product of it. The years of perceived humiliation by foreign powers and the continuation of the old order, where Russia was inadvertently cast as perpetual enemy, combined with a kleptocratic, corrupt, and deeply flawed democracy, drove Russian Democrats underground and gave life to nationalists and fascists. They promised a return to greatness and paint the West and by association democracy as evils that wished to see Russia fail and therefore had to be combated. Putin would make sure that authoritarianism in Russia was no fad, by using the easily pliable constitution to continue to strengthen his executive power, as Yeltsin had briefly flirted with.